question today is, how did the early church respond in wake of the death of the first generation Christians? So although the early church had the apostles and very distinguished church leaders that had been in the presence of Jesus, although the early church had at first had these leaders to lead them and guide them, after their death, the church had to decide how to lead themselves effectively. So they did three things in the wake of the first generation death. They organized the apostolic writings into a canon. They established authority through apostolic succession. And then thirdly, they worked to make a church hierarchy. So first, the church gathered and organized the apostles' writings into a canon. So there's this bishop named Marcion who taught that the harsh and unloving God of the Old Testament could not possibly line up with the God that Jesus talked about as his Father, the God that was loving and merciful. And so Marcion basically said that these Old Testament and New Testament gods were not compatible, and they could not be reconciled to each other. So Marcion rejected all of the Torah for only a few of Paul's writings and then some of the Gospel of Luke. And a quote here says that from Robert M. Grant says, Marcion forced more Orthodox Christians to examine their own presuppositions and to state more clearly what they already believed. So after Marcion came out with these wacky ideas, the church had to decide what it believed and had to combat Marcion's ideas by putting the apostolic writings into a codex. So, actually, interestingly enough, we often think of the Old Testament canon being written before the New Testament, but in fact, the Old Testament canon wasn't completed till a lot later than the New Testament. So that's just interesting. But basically, Marcion forced the Christians that were Orthodox to say, hey guys, we need to put all these apostolic writings together to have on hand, because when conflict would arise in the church, they needed answers, and so they put all the apostolic writings together. And then second thing they did in the wake of the death of the first generation Christians was to establish apostolic succession. So what exactly is apostolic succession? It is the teaching that bishops should be traced back directly to Jesus' apostles. So any ordained bishop should trace back from generation of bishop to generation from the Jesus apostles and disciples to give them validity. And this goes along with the Roman theology that when your ancestors died, you would embody them. So this is really interesting because we see the Roman culture infiltrating the early church. So Tertullian says, let them, meaning the bishops, unfold the role of their bishops running down due succession, and be able to show for his ordainer and predecessor some one of the apostles or apostolic men. So Tertullian is basically telling them that they need to be able to show proof that they were somehow related from bishop to bishop to be traced back to Jesus' apostles. And then the third thing that the church did in the wake of the first generation deaths was to establish church hierarchy. Congregations were now beyond the scope of what one church leader could handle, especially in big cities like Alexandria, I don't know how to say that, or Antioch. The churches needed more leadership than just a bishop could handle. So there were deacons and elders to help lighten that load. But as the churches expanded and grew, it was harder for the deacons and the elders and the bishops to do that. So a church hierarchy started to form, and at the end of the 2nd century, the seeds of hierarchy were planted. And now after that, the bishop position in the church became a full-time job. Prior to that, the position of bishop and all of the other positions in the church were just part-time, and then the men that held them would have other traits that they would do. So, in the lecture it says, slowly, over the course of the 2nd and 3rd centuries, a unified idea of how overall church should be structured was put into place. The ranks of clergy and their duties were standardized. So over time, the hierarchy of the church was built till it became what it is known as today, with the Pope and the bishops and I don't know. Anyway, so how did the early church respond in the wake of the death of the first Christians? Well, they did 3 things. First, they put all the apostolic writings into a canon. Second, they established authority through apostolic succession. And then third, they worked to make a church hierarchy. Okay. Also, if you're wondering what happened to this finger, I broke it. So, yeah. Not that anyone cares. Okay, peace out.